Blackthorn Hall had learned how to bury its sins quietly, but on the morning the Duke of Ashcombe arrived unannounced, the silence cracked before the gates were fully opened. A carriage rolled over the gravel drive without herald or warning, its dark crest catching the pale light, and somewhere deep within the servants' wing Maribel Hale felt the shift before anyone spoke his name. She had lived long enough in deliberate obscurity to recognize disruption, the subtle tightening of air when power entered a place that depended on concealment to survive. Orders rippled through the house with unnatural speed, footsteps quickened, voices lowered, and Maribel was pushed further back into shadow, reminded without words that she was not meant to exist where she might be seen. She moved through narrow corridors carrying linen she had folded too carefully, her posture trained into smallness, her gaze lowered by habit rather than submission. Blackthorn Hall was awake in a way it never was for ordinary guests, the walls holding their breath, the family upstairs rehearsing courtesy while guarding something far more fragile than pride. Maribel knew this rhythm intimately. She had been shaped by it since childhood, taught which doors never opened for her, which questions were never asked, and which truths would cost her the only shelter she had ever known. Her name was spoken rarely and only behind closed doors, a precaution rather than affection, and yet she had learned to endure by becoming unremarkable, invisible, forgettable. The Duke did not arrive through the grand entrance prepared for him. He stepped instead through a side passage, dismissing ceremony with the ease of a man accustomed to obedience, his presence immediate and unsettling. He noticed the way servants stiffened, the way glances slid away too quickly, the way the house itself seemed arranged to hide something just out of sight. He was turning a corner when a lantern flame wavered, casting light into a narrow corridor where Maribel stood frozen, trapped between retreat and exposure. She looked up before she could stop herself, instinct breaking discipline, and their eyes met in a moment that felt dangerously loud. He saw intelligence sharpened by restraint, fear tempered with dignity, and a consciousness far too deliberate for someone meant to be overlooked. She saw recognition, not curiosity alone, but awareness sharpened into intent. A voice called her away sharply, too sharply, and the spell broke. Maribel withdrew at once, her heart pounding with the knowledge that something irreversible had occurred. The Duke remained still long after she vanished from view, watching the empty corridor as though the house itself had revealed a fault line. Whatever Blackthorn Hall was hiding, it was not insignificant, and it was not content to remain buried. In that single exchange, unspoken and brief, the balance shifted. Maribel returned to the shadows she knew so well, but the shadows no longer felt secure, and the Duke of Ashcombe, newly arrived and already unwelcome in ways no one dared name, understood with sudden clarity that the most important secret in the house was not written in ledgers or locked in drawers, but walking quietly among those determined to pretend she did not exist. By the second morning of his stay, the Duke of Ashcombe had learned that Blackthorn Hall was governed less by tradition than by fear carefully disguised as propriety. Breakfast unfolded with rehearsed civility, the family attentive to his comfort, yet strained in a way that betrayed vigilance rather than hospitality. Conversations curved away from history, from lineage, from anything that might require specificity, and the Duke listened with the patience of a man accustomed to hearing what was not said. He watched servants move with unusual precision, eyes lowered not in respect but caution, as though the walls themselves might report indiscretions. Somewhere within this ordered restraint was the young woman he had seen the night before, and the knowledge of her existence unsettled him more than any political slight ever had. She did not belong to the margins where he had found her, not in bearing, not in awareness, and certainly not in the way the household had reacted to her brief visibility. Maribel, meanwhile, spent the morning confined to the farthest reaches of the servants' wing, assigned tasks so redundant they bordered on punishment. She scrubbed surfaces already clean, folded linens already stacked, and endured the watchful presence of a senior housekeeper whose silence carried warning enough. The lantern-lit encounter replayed relentlessly in her mind, not as romance or fantasy, but as danger. Being seen had consequences. It always had. She had been taught this lesson young, reminded that attention invited questions, and questions invited decisions made without her consent. The Duke's gaze had not been careless or dismissive. It had lingered with intent, and that frightened her more than indifference ever could. She told herself he would forget her, that men of his standing rarely troubled themselves with anomalies best left unexplained, yet her chest tightened with the certainty that he would not. He did not. Instead, the Duke altered his habits with subtle precision, choosing paths through the house that were inefficient but revealing, lingering where servants gathered, asking polite, inconsequential questions that nonetheless unsettled those tasked with answering them. Each inquiry was met with courteous vagueness, each name offered followed by a pause where another should have been spoken and was not. When he mentioned the corridor where he had lost his way the previous evening, the room grew momentarily still. The family matriarch recovered first, smiling thinly, dismissing the confusion as nothing more than a servant hurrying about her duties. Nothing more. The phrase echoed in his mind, heavy with deliberate diminishment. Maribel sensed the shift before she understood it. Doors once merely closed were now guarded. Her movements were curtailed further, her presence managed with increasing urgency. A warning was delivered without warmth, reminding her of the family's generosity and the fragility of her position. Gratitude, she was told, was protection. Silence was safety. She nodded as required, but something within her had begun to resist. The Duke's interest, however dangerous, had awakened an awareness she could not suppress, the knowledge that someone had looked at her and seen not a burden, not a mistake, but a question worth pursuing. As the day wore on, both understood, from opposite ends of the house, that whatever lay buried beneath Blackthorn Hall had begun to surface, and that the cost of keeping it hidden was about to rise. Maribel learned the truth in fragments, the way one learned anything forbidden in Blackthorn Hall, through pauses that lingered too long and voices that assumed her absence. She had been sent to return a tray to the small breakfast parlor long after it had been cleared, an unnecessary errand that placed her precisely where she was not expected to linger. From the corridor beyond the half-closed door came the low cadence of conversation, familiar voices stripped of their public polish, and she slowed despite herself, instinct warring with dread. A name was spoken, then halted, corrected mid-syllable, followed by a sharp admonition and the unmistakable word inheritance uttered as though it were dangerous. Someone laughed softly, without humor, remarking that certain mistakes were best kept invisible, that records could be amended, histories refined, and inconvenient truths taught to disappear. Maribel stood very still, the tray growing heavy in her hands, understanding with quiet devastation that her life had not been shaped by misfortune alone, but by deliberate design. She withdrew without sound, heart racing, the knowledge settling into her bones with terrible clarity. She was not hidden to protect herself, she was hidden to protect them. Every rule she had obeyed, every silence she had honored, had served a purpose that had nothing to do with kindness. The thought should have ignited anger, yet what rose instead was grief, a mourning for a self she had never been permitted to imagine. She moved through the house with mechanical care, her thoughts racing ahead of her steps, and it was this distraction that led her, without intent, into the small south gallery where winter light filtered through tall windows rarely used. The Duke was there, studying a landscape with apparent idleness, though his attention shifted the moment she entered. There was no surprise in his expression, only recognition, as though he had anticipated her arrival. Their exchange was brief but charged, words chosen with care and weighted with implication. He spoke of the house, of its peculiar silences and omissions, and asked, not directly but clearly, whether she found life there comfortable. Maribel answered with the truth she had been trained to give, polite and empty, yet something in her tone betrayed her, a restraint too deliberate to be natural. He observed rather than pressed, remarking instead on her education, her diction, the incongruity between her manner and her station. No one had ever named that dissonance aloud. The acknowledgement unsettled her more than accusation could have done. When she excused herself, she did so with composure intact, but nerves unsteady, aware that she had been measured and found significant. Left alone, the Duke stood in the quiet gallery, the weight of confirmation settling heavily. What he had glimpsed the previous night was no anomaly but evidence, and the household's unease now made sense in ways that sharpened his resolve. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase her, and erasure of that kind was never without motive. He did not yet know her history, her name beyond what was permitted, or the precise nature of the injustice, but he understood enough to recognize intention when he saw it. From that moment, curiosity gave way to purpose. Whatever truth Blackthorn Hall had buried, it was bound to her existence, and the Duke of Ashcombe had no intention of leaving it undisturbed. The summons came just before dusk, delivered with a formality that stripped it of kindness. Maribel was instructed to present herself in the small withdrawing room reserved for matters the family preferred not to acknowledge publicly. She knew the room well. It was where rules were clarified, where gratitude was reinforced, where obedience was shaped into something resembling virtue. As she crossed the corridor, she felt the weight of the afternoon's revelations pressing against her composure, yet she entered with the same quiet poise she had perfected over years of necessity. The family matriarch sat near the fire, hands folded, her expression composed in the way of a woman accustomed to controlling narratives rather than confronting them. The reminder was delivered calmly, almost gently. Maribel was told that recent disturbances had made discretion more important than ever, that her presence must be carefully managed for everyone's good. The word family was used repeatedly, as both shield and warning, and generosity was invoked as though it were a debt rather than a choice. Visibility, she was cautioned, invited speculation, and speculation was dangerous. Maribel listened without interruption, nodding where expected, her silence interpreted as compliance. Yet, beneath that stillness, something had shifted. For the first time, she understood the rules not as immutable truths but as instruments, designed to keep her contained. Fear remained, but it no longer stood alone. It now shared space with resentment sharpened by clarity. Later that evening, the Duke encountered the matriarch in the long gallery, where portraits watched from gilded frames heavy with inherited certainty. Their conversation unfolded with measured politeness, his questions framed as casual interest, hers answered with practiced evasion. He spoke of the house's history, of its curious gaps, of how certain stories seemed deliberately smoothed over. She smiled, deflecting with remarks about time's tendency to blur inconvenient details, yet her composure tightened almost imperceptibly. The Duke noticed. He always did. When he mentioned the young woman he had seen moving through the house with uncommon bearing, the pause that followed spoke more loudly than denial ever could. Their exchange ended without resolution, but the tension lingered, stretching invisibly through the corridors that separated them. Later still, in a brief crossing near the servants' stair, Maribel and the Duke found themselves momentarily alone. No words were exchanged, none required. He inclined his head with respect rather than command, a gesture so simple and so rare it unsettled her more deeply than interrogation would have done. In that glance passed an unspoken understanding. He knew she was constrained. She knew he recognized it. The acknowledgement did not free her, but it altered the shape of her confinement. As Maribel returned to her narrow room, the house seemed less solid than it had that morning, its walls no longer absolute. The Duke, watching the shadows lengthen from a distant window, understood that courtesy alone would not preserve peace for much longer. Silence had been the family's greatest weapon, but silence, once noticed, was fragile, and it was beginning to fracture. The gathering was meant to be unremarkable, a modest evening reception arranged to reassure neighboring families that Blackthorn Hall remained orderly, untroubled, unchanged. Lamps were lit early, chairs aligned with precision, and conversation guided carefully toward weather and travel rather than lineage or legacy. Maribel had been instructed to remain out of sight unless summoned, her role reduced to preparation without presence. She accepted the directive with outward calm, though unease threaded through her as she moved between rooms, sensing tension coiled beneath the surface civility. The house felt too alert, as though waiting for a misstep. The misstep came unexpectedly. A spilled tray, a minor disruption, required immediate correction, and before anyone could intercept her, Maribel was called forward to assist. She entered the room with practiced composure, eyes lowered, movements efficient, intent on vanishing as swiftly as she had appeared. Yet the moment stretched. Several guests looked up, registering her with passing curiosity, while the family hastened to redirect attention. The Duke of Ashcombe, however, did not look away. He watched with quiet focus, noting the contrast between her calm authority and the way others sought to diminish her presence. When she finished her task and stepped back, he addressed her directly, thanking her with a courtesy that carried weight, his tone measured but unmistakably respectful. The effect was immediate. Conversation faltered, glances exchanged, and a current of unease rippled through the room. The family matriarch stiffened, offering a swift, dismissive explanation of Maribel's role, but the Duke acknowledged her competence again, this time commenting on the efficiency of the household rather than the servant herself. It was a careful choice, one that shielded Maribel from overt scrutiny while making retreat impossible. She felt the attention like heat against her skin, terrifying and strange, accompanied by an unfamiliar sensation that bordered on pride. No one had ever spoken of her in such a way before, as though her presence contributed rather than intruded. As the evening progressed, whispers threaded through the edges of conversation, speculation blooming where certainty had once reigned. Maribel withdrew as instructed, heart pounding, aware that something fundamental had shifted. She had not spoken out of turn, she had not disobeyed, yet invisibility had failed her all the same. In the quiet that followed, she understood with chilling clarity that the safety she had been promised through silence had always been conditional, and that condition was no longer being honored. The Duke accepted the consequences of his intervention with composed resolve. He recognized the alarm he had sparked and did not regret it. Whatever secret the family guarded, it relied on cooperation born of fear and habit, and fear was already loosening its grip. From opposite ends of Blackthorn Hall, both he and Maribel felt the same truth settle heavily between them. Retreat was no longer an option. What had been buried was now stirring, and the cost of keeping it hidden had risen beyond control. By the following morning, the atmosphere at Blackthorn Hall had shifted from vigilance into something sharper, more deliberate. Doors closed more quietly than before. Conversations ceased when footsteps approached, and servants moved with the strained precision of people aware they were being observed for the wrong reasons. The Duke of Ashcombe noted every change. He had learned long ago that secrecy rarely survived daylight, and he adjusted his attention accordingly, rising early and requesting access to household records under the pretense of understanding the estate's history. The request was met with polite resistance softened by excuses, references to misplaced keys and outdated inventories, yet even refusal revealed intention. Absence, he knew, could be as informative as presence. Maribel felt the tightening restrictions immediately. Her duties were confined to the inner passages, her movements supervised with a vigilance that no longer pretended benevolence. Instructions were repeated more often than necessary, framed as reminders rather than warnings, yet the message was unmistakable. She was being contained. Guilt crept in despite her efforts to resist it, a familiar reflex shaped by years of being told that disruption followed her existence. She worried for the servants who offered her small kindnesses, for the Duke whose attention now placed him at odds with the household's carefully curated order. Yet beneath the guilt, something fragile but persistent took root. The knowledge that someone had noticed the injustice made it harder to accept silence as duty. The Duke's inquiries extended beyond ledgers. He questioned long-serving staff with casual courtesy, asking about changes in management, about rooms no longer used, about names that once appeared in correspondence and no longer did. Answers came hesitantly, shaped by loyalty and fear, yet patterns emerged all the same. One particular year was referenced obliquely, always accompanied by a pause, a glance, a deflection. The Duke marked it carefully, recognizing deliberate omission when he saw it. Records had been altered, not crudely, but with the meticulous care of people determined to erase without trace. In the late afternoon, he crossed paths with Maribel in a service corridor narrow enough to force acknowledgement. She stiffened instinctively, prepared to retreat, but he spoke first, quietly, remarking only that the house seemed very determined to remain unchanged. The observation was innocuous on its surface, yet laden with meaning. Maribel met his gaze briefly, enough to convey understanding, then lowered her eyes as habit demanded. The exchange lasted seconds, but it confirmed what both already sensed. They were being watched, managed, and underestimated. As evening settled, the Duke reviewed the fragments he had gathered, certainty solidifying into resolve. This was not neglect, it was strategy. Someone had decided long ago that Maribel's existence posed a threat significant enough to justify systematic erasure. He understood now that uncovering the truth would not be simple, nor without consequence, but retreat was no longer possible. Across the house, Maribel lay awake in her narrow room, aware that the fragile hope stirring within her was dangerous, yet unable to extinguish it. Something had begun to move, and neither fear nor tradition would be enough to stop it. The conservatory had been abandoned long before neglect made it obvious, its glass panes clouded by years of restraint rather than decay, the plants within trimmed back until nothing dared grow beyond its assigned space. Maribel had been sent there under the guise of tidying, a task no one truly cared to inspect, and she welcomed the solitude with guarded relief. The filtered light softened the room, blurring edges, offering a rare sense of quiet that did not feel watched. She had just finished arranging a stack of tools when footsteps sounded behind her, measured and unhurried, and she knew without turning who it would be. The Duke of Ashcombe did not announce himself. He merely occupied the space with the calm assurance of someone accustomed to being where he chose. Their conversation began cautiously, neither acknowledging the improbability of the meeting. He remarked on the conservatory's former purpose, on how houses often revealed their secrets through the rooms they abandoned. Maribel answered politely, her tone restrained, but something in the privacy loosened her guard. When he asked whether she enjoyed reading, the question caught her unprepared, not for its intimacy, but for its assumption. No one ever assumed her preferences. She hesitated, then admitted she did, carefully, explaining that books had been permitted when they were useful rather than entertaining. The Duke listened without interruption, his attention focused in a way that made her words feel unexpectedly weighty. As she spoke, fragments of herself emerged that had long been held in reserve. She mentioned lessons discontinued without explanation, subjects deemed unnecessary, ambitions quietly redirected toward obedience. There was no bitterness in her account, only clarity sharpened by acceptance. The Duke did not interrupt, did not correct, did not soften her experience with sympathy. He observed, acknowledged, and allowed silence to give her words room to settle. The restraint in his response unsettled her more than reassurance might have done. She was used to dismissal or command, not consideration. When he remarked, simply, that such limitations seemed intentional rather than accidental, the truth of it resonated deeply, echoing thoughts she had never allowed herself to form aloud. The moment stretched, charged not with impropriety but with recognition. Maribel became acutely aware of how rarely she had been spoken to as an equal, how unfamiliar it felt to be addressed without condescension or caution. The Duke, in turn, recognized the discipline beneath her composure, the intelligence shaped by constraint rather than absence. Attraction surfaced quietly, neither named nor pursued, expressed instead through measured attention and deliberate restraint. It was not desire that bound the moment, but understanding. Their exchange ended as quietly as it began. Maribel excused herself with practiced grace, though her pulse betrayed her calm. As she left, she carried with her the unsettling realization that being seen could feel like both danger and relief. The Duke remained among the muted greenery, certainty deepening. The injustice he sensed was no abstraction now. It had a voice, a presence, a dignity that demanded acknowledgement. From that point forward, distance was no longer possible. What had passed between them could not be undone, and both understood, in their separate ways, that restraint would only sharpen what had already begun to take form. The decision was not announced so much as implied, spoken of in lowered tones and half-finished sentences that assumed Maribel would never be permitted the dignity of hearing it directly. She learned of it the way she learned everything of consequence, by listening carefully and trusting instinct more than reassurance. A word repeated too often, a trunk moved from storage, the sudden interest in charitable placements beyond the county. By evening, the shape of the plan was clear enough to chill her. She was to be removed quietly, sent away under the guise of benevolence, her absence explained as opportunity rather than erasure. Obedience, she realized with hollow clarity, would not save her this time. Silence had never been protection. It had only delayed decision. Fear pressed in hard and familiar, urging retreat, compliance, disappearance. Yet something resisted. The memory of the Duke's steady attention, his refusal to dismiss what others diminished, lingered with unsettling force. For the first time, Maribel considered the possibility that endurance did not require invisibility. The thought terrified her. Seeking him out felt reckless, almost disloyal to the rules that had shaped her survival. But the alternative was surrender to a fate chosen without her consent. When she found him in the small library near dusk, she did not announce herself. She simply stood, hands folded, waiting until he looked up and saw not intrusion but intention. Her words were careful, restrained, offering only what was necessary. She spoke of impending arrangements, of concerns framed as kindness, of decisions made swiftly and without consultation. She did not ask for rescue. She asked for clarity. The Duke listened, his expression controlled, though something sharpened behind his eyes. He understood at once what was being attempted and recognized it for what it was. Containment disguised as charity. His response was measured, but unmistakable. He told her she owed obedience to no decision that erased her. That choice, if it was to mean anything, had to belong to her. The words settled heavily, unsettling years of learned compliance. For Maribel, the exchange marked a fragile crossing. Trust did not come easily, nor fully, but it began to form, shaped by the absence of demand in his tone. He did not promise safety. He did not offer solutions. He acknowledged risk and consequence without retreating from responsibility. That restraint mattered. It told her she was not a problem to be managed, but a person whose will carried weight. Fear remained, but it no longer stood unchallenged. The household sensed the shift almost immediately. Watchfulness intensified, courtesy grew brittle, and Maribel was observed with renewed scrutiny. Yet beneath the tension, something irrevocable had changed. She had spoken. She had been heard. The Duke, moving through the corridors with calm resolve, understood that concealment was nearing its limit. Plans built on silence could not withstand choice once it was claimed. From that evening onward, whatever followed would do so in the open, and the cost of forcing Maribel back into the shadows would no longer be borne quietly. The ledger was not discovered so much as uncovered, its existence betrayed by the careful way it had been hidden among records meant to appear complete. The Duke of Ashcombe found it late in the afternoon, when the house had settled into the uneasy quiet that followed too much restraint. He had been granted access to the estate's older documents under supervision, a concession intended to placate rather than enlighten, yet years of political negotiation had taught him where to look for intention disguised as disorder. One volume, thinner than the rest, bore signs of frequent handling despite its age, its spine softened, its pages unevenly worn. It contained no overt confession, no dramatic declaration, but in its margins lay the truth. Names altered by a single stroke, dates shifted just enough to confuse succession, payments recorded to individuals whose loyalty had been purchased and whose silence had been ensured. One entry, referenced repeatedly but never fully explained, pointed unmistakably toward legitimacy deliberately obscured. The implications were severe. The Duke closed the ledger slowly, understanding that what he held was not merely evidence but a weapon capable of destroying reputations and reshaping futures. He did not yet know how much Maribel understood, nor how much she wished to know, and the distinction mattered. Truth, once revealed, could not be returned to its hiding place. It demanded consequence. He spent the next hours verifying fragments, comparing handwriting, confirming patterns, assembling a picture too deliberate to dismiss as coincidence. By the time evening approached, certainty had replaced suspicion. Maribel's life had been shaped by forgery and fear, her obscurity engineered to preserve an inheritance that had never been secure. When he spoke to her later, he chose his words with uncommon care. He did not present the ledger. He did not overwhelm her with detail. Instead, he told her enough to confirm what she already sensed, that her existence had been altered on paper as well as in practice, that records had been manipulated to justify her erasure. Maribel listened in silence, her expression composed even as her hands tightened in her lap. Relief surfaced first, sharp and disorienting, followed swiftly by grief. The truth validated her instincts, but it also stripped away the last comfort of uncertainty. What had happened to her was not accidental. It had been decided. Emotion threatened to fracture her control, yet she held it together with remarkable restraint, asking only what this knowledge meant now. The Duke answered honestly. Exposure would bring protection, but also scrutiny. Silence would preserve peace, but at the cost of her autonomy. He made no recommendation. The choice, he emphasized, was hers. That insistence mattered more than the evidence itself. For the first time, her future was not being arranged around her, but offered to her. As they parted, both understood the danger had escalated. The family could no longer rely on concealment alone. Somewhere within Blackthorn Hall, others would sense the shift soon enough. The Duke carried the ledger with him, its weight symbolic as much as real. Maribel returned to her room, the knowledge settling heavily yet strangely steadying. The truth had emerged, fragile but undeniable, and whatever followed would no longer be built entirely on lies she had been trained to endure. The near exposure came disguised as civility, the most dangerous form it could take at Blackthorn Hall. A small luncheon had been arranged for neighboring gentry, informal enough to discourage scrutiny, yet public enough to reaffirm stability. The family relied on habit to maintain control, on the assumption that no one would look too closely if everything appeared orderly. Maribel was instructed to remain well away from the gathering, her absence treated as precaution rather than necessity, but the house had begun to betray its own tension. Servants whispered too carefully. Doors closed too quickly. The illusion of calm required more effort than it ever had before. The moment arrived without warning. A guest, familiar with the estate's history, remarked casually on how unchanged Blackthorn Hall seemed, despite past rumors of complications following an old succession dispute. The word dispute lingered just long enough to draw attention. The family matriarch responded smoothly, dismissing it as local exaggeration, but another guest followed with a thoughtless addition, mentioning records once rumored to be incomplete. Eyes turned, silence tightened, the atmosphere shifted from polite to precarious in the space of a breath. Maribel, stationed in the adjoining corridor, sensed the danger before she heard it spoken aloud. Her name was not used, but implication traveled faster than language. Someone referred to a dependent once kept out of sight, another to a charitable arrangement that had supposedly resolved matters long ago. The family moved quickly to redirect, yet their urgency betrayed them. Before Maribel could retreat further, the Duke stepped into the conversation with calm authority, his timing precise. He spoke of records often misunderstood, of how rumors flourished when truth was deliberately obscured by overzealous caretaking. His tone was conversational, almost idle, but his words landed with unmistakable force. Without naming Maribel, he reframed the discussion entirely, emphasizing competence, integrity, and the danger of assuming absence equated insignificance. The shift was subtle, but decisive. Attention moved away from conjecture and toward the Duke himself, whose reputation commanded respect even from those inclined to curiosity. The family followed his lead reluctantly, relief and resentment mingling behind polite smiles. The crisis passed, but the damage was done. The boundary had been crossed. Authority had been asserted where silence once ruled. Maribel withdrew fully now, heart racing, aware of how narrowly she had avoided becoming spectacle, yet beneath the fear was something else, something steadier. The Duke had not dismissed the danger. He had absorbed it, redirected it, placed himself squarely between her and exposure. He had chosen opposition without declaration, protection without ownership. The cost of that choice would not be small. Later, alone with the knowledge of what had nearly occurred, Maribel understood that concealment was no longer sustainable. Whispers had escaped containment. Attention had been drawn. Whatever path lay ahead would require confrontation rather than avoidance. Across the estate, the Duke considered the same truth. The family's control depended on cooperation born of fear, and fear was weakening. From that afternoon onward, the conflict could no longer remain quiet. What had been buried was pressing closer to the surface, and neither courtesy nor tradition would be enough to force it back into the dark. The quiet that followed the luncheon felt unnatural, stretched thin by what had nearly been spoken aloud. Blackthorn Hall settled into itself with forced calm, yet Maribel sensed the shift in the way one sensed an approaching storm, not through sound but through pressure. She spent the afternoon in constrained tasks meant to occupy rather than serve, her thoughts circling relentlessly around the Duke's intervention. He had acted without consulting her, yet not without regard for her dignity, and the distinction mattered more than she could easily articulate. For the first time, someone had stepped into danger not to silence her existence, but to prevent it from being distorted. When evening drew in, she found the courage to seek him out, though every step toward the smaller west sitting room felt like a quiet rebellion. He was alone, reading by the fire, and looked up immediately, setting the book aside as though he had been expecting her. Maribel remained standing, hands folded, posture precise, uncertainty flickering beneath her composure. She began carefully, recounting fragments of her past not as confession but as context, describing a childhood governed by rules that shifted without explanation, education granted and withdrawn, affection replaced by instruction. She spoke of gratitude demanded rather than earned, of silence praised as virtue. She did not name cruelty, yet it lingered in every measured phrase. The Duke listened without interruption, his attention unwavering. He asked no probing questions, offered no commentary until she finished, allowing her words to exist without correction or consolation. When he finally spoke, it was not to challenge her account, but to acknowledge it. He told her plainly that what she described bore the shape of control rather than care, that obligation enforced through fear was no obligation at all. The simplicity of the statement unsettled her more deeply than outrage might have done. It reframed her experience not as personal failure, but as systemic design. Emotion pressed dangerously close to the surface, yet Maribel maintained restraint, accustomed to survival through control. She admitted, in a rare moment of vulnerability, that she feared becoming the cause of further disruption, that his involvement might cost him influence or standing. The Duke met that concern with quiet firmness. He told her that responsibility lay with those who engineered injustice, not with those who endured it. He made no promises of rescue, no assurances of outcome, only the commitment that he would not act without her consent. That promise, more than any declaration, shifted the ground beneath her feet. As the conversation ended, Maribel felt both steadied and unsettled. Trust did not come easily, but it had begun to take shape, forged not through dependence, but respect. She returned to her room with the strange realization that she had been heard fully and left unchanged in her autonomy. The Duke remained by the fire long after she departed, aware that restraint alone would not be enough much longer. What lay ahead would require not only exposure but endurance, and for the first time, he understood that Maribel was not merely the subject of injustice, but its most capable challenger. The pressure did not arrive loudly, nor all at once. It filtered in through letters delivered with unusual care, through visits framed as courtesy but weighted with expectation, through conversations that assumed the Duke of Ashcombe would recognize the wisdom of restraint. Old allies hinted at concern for his reputation, at the danger of entangling himself in domestic irregularities better left unexamined. Words like discretion and stability surfaced repeatedly, polished until they sounded like virtue rather than avoidance. The Duke listened with practiced calm, acknowledging each warning without committing to withdraw. He had learned long ago that opposition often wore the mask of concern, and that yielding quietly was how injustices survived. Maribel felt the consequences of that pressure without ever being named as its cause. The household's demeanor toward her shifted again, this time cloaked in brittle politeness. Restrictions were enforced with smiles rather than reprimands, her movements allowed but monitored, her presence tolerated rather than erased. She understood the tactic instinctively. Control no longer relied solely on fear, but on the suggestion that disruption would be attributed to her unwillingness to remain unobtrusive. Guilt pressed in, familiar and sharp, urging her to withdraw, to minimize herself for the sake of others. Yet something resisted more strongly now. The Duke's refusal to retreat had altered her understanding of responsibility. Endurance no longer felt synonymous with obedience. She encountered him one afternoon in the outer gardens, a space open enough to feel exposed, yet quiet enough to allow honesty. He spoke first, informing her of the pressure he faced, not as complaint, but as fact. He did not frame it as sacrifice, nor did he imply obligation. The choice, he reiterated, remained hers, and he would not proceed without her consent. The insistence unsettled her in its fairness. For years, decisions had been made around her, justified as protection. Now, she was being asked to decide whether truth was worth the cost of disturbance. Maribel surprised herself by speaking without rehearsed caution. She told him she was tired of being managed into silence, tired of existing only where she caused the least inconvenience. She admitted fear, but refused to let it dictate her future. The words felt dangerous and liberating in equal measure. The Duke listened, absorbing not only her resolve, but the weight it carried. He did not praise her courage or diminish her fear. He accepted both as truth. From that exchange, something subtle but vital shifted. Maribel began asserting herself in small, deliberate ways, asking questions previously withheld, making choices that acknowledged her presence rather than apologized for it. The household responded with unease, sensing loss of control even where nothing overt had changed. The Duke, observing this quiet transformation, recognized its significance. Power rarely collapsed under confrontation alone. It eroded when those it constrained began to recognize themselves as worthy of voice. As evening fell, both understood that the path forward would not be eased by compliance. The forces pressing for silence were steady and patient, but so, now, was resolve. Whatever followed would test endurance rather than defiance, and Maribel, once buried by design, was learning to stand without asking permission. The meeting was arranged without acknowledgement, spoken of only in implication, and carried out under the pretense of routine. Maribel was instructed to deliver documents to the old steward's quarters at the far edge of the estate, a place rarely visited now that its former occupant lived in quiet retirement nearby. She understood the risk immediately. The steward had served Blackthorn Hall before silence became policy, before records were refined and history softened. If anyone still carried the unaltered truth, it would be him. Her steps felt heavier as she approached the small sitting room where he waited, the weight of anticipation pressing against her restraint. The steward was older than she remembered, his posture bent but his eyes clear, sharpened by years of watching decisions made above his station. He greeted her with careful courtesy, dismissing the servant's role she had been forced to occupy, and addressing her with the respect she had rarely been afforded. When the Duke joined them moments later, the purpose of the meeting became undeniable. The steward produced a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, their paper worn thin by time rather than use. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as though choosing accuracy over comfort. What he revealed dismantled the last illusions Maribel had carried unknowingly. Her birth, he explained, had been legitimate, the result of a lawful union inconvenient to those who stood to benefit from its erasure. When inheritance was threatened, records were altered, witnesses silenced, and loyalty purchased with quiet urgency. Maribel had been spared public disgrace only because secrecy served better than scandal. As the steward spoke, Maribel felt the careful architecture of her past collapse inward. Relief surged first, sharp and disorienting, followed by grief so profound it threatened to fracture her composure. She had not imagined her displacement. It had been orchestrated. The Duke remained silent throughout, his presence steady, his attention fixed on Maribel rather than the documents. When the steward finished, the room felt unnaturally still. Maribel struggled to speak, the magnitude of what she had lost colliding with the clarity of what she now knew. Her identity had been stolen not by neglect, but by design. Years of minimization had not been kindness, but calculation. The truth hurt precisely because it explained everything. She did not cry. Control held, though barely. What emerged instead was resolve, fragile but unmistakable. The Duke spoke then, not to direct or persuade, but to acknowledge. He told her the truth changed nothing about her worth, only about the lies imposed upon her. Exposure would come with consequence, he warned, but concealment would cost her far more. The choice, as always, remained hers. When Maribel left the meeting, the world felt both heavier and clearer. The past could no longer be endured as misunderstanding. It demanded reckoning. Somewhere deep within her, grief settled into purpose. Whatever followed, she would no longer accept a life shaped by silence that was never meant to protect her. The attempt to remove her was executed with the efficiency of people accustomed to deciding without consent. It began after midnight, when Blackthorn Hall lay suspended in false sleep, corridors dimmed and voices lowered to avoid witness. Maribel was summoned from her room under the pretense of immediate necessity, told only that arrangements had been finalized and delay would be inconvenient. A trunk stood packed by the door, its contents chosen without her involvement, its presence a quiet declaration that her life was once again being redirected. No explanation was offered beyond assurances of safety and generosity, words she now recognized as instruments rather than comfort. Fear rose swiftly, sharp and familiar, but it no longer governed her entirely. The truth she had learned had stripped obedience of its illusion. She did not protest, knowing resistance would be framed as instability, but she did not submit either. She asked where she was being taken. The answer was vague. She asked under what authority. Silence followed. That silence confirmed everything. As they moved toward the side entrance, urgency replaced courtesy, the family intent on concluding the matter before daylight could interfere. The interruption came with controlled inevitability. The Duke of Ashcombe stepped into the passage ahead of them, his presence calm, his timing precise. He did not raise his voice. He did not accuse. He asked one question only, whether Maribel was leaving of her own will. The pause that followed exposed more than any confession could have done. The family matriarch recovered quickly, asserting benevolent intent, insisting the arrangement was for Maribel's benefit. The Duke listened, then produced documentation that rendered denial irrelevant. He spoke of altered records, of purchased silence, of legitimacy buried beneath fear. Each word was delivered without dramatics, its weight undeniable. The confrontation unfolded without spectacle, yet its impact was seismic. Servants halted in doorways. Witnesses gathered despite themselves. Authority fractured under the strain of exposure. Maribel stood silent throughout, her presence steady, her posture unyielding. When she finally spoke, her voice did not tremble. She stated simply that she would not leave under deception, that her life would no longer be arranged in darkness. The declaration carried more force than any demand. Silence followed, heavy and irreversible. The family yielded not out of contrition, but necessity. Control had failed. Retreat became unavoidable. The Duke did not gloat. He merely ensured that Maribel was free to return to her room unescorted, uncontained. The act was small, yet transformative. It signaled that the terms governing her existence had changed. Later, alone, Maribel sat awake as the magnitude of what had occurred settled fully. The fear remained, but it no longer defined her. She had been confronted, threatened, nearly erased again, and yet she had stood. The Duke, pacing a distant gallery, understood that concealment was finished. Whatever followed would now do so in the open, and the cost of injustice would finally be paid by those who had relied too long on silence to protect them. Morning arrived without ceremony, its light exposing the fractures left behind by the night's confrontation. Blackthorn Hall no longer felt cohesive, its authority splintered by what had been witnessed and could not be unseen. Servants moved with cautious curiosity, no longer avoiding Maribel's presence with practiced indifference. Whispers followed her not as warning, but as acknowledgement. She felt them keenly, the sudden awareness that her existence was no longer confined to shadow. Fear lingered, yet beneath it was a steadiness she had never known, born not of protection but of choice. The family summoned her before noon, the request formal and unmistakably public. This time, Maribel entered the room without the instinctive sense of smallness she had carried for years. She stood upright, hands relaxed at her sides, her composure deliberate. The matriarch spoke first, framing the previous night as misunderstanding, emphasizing reputation, urging restraint for the sake of peace. Maribel listened until the words lost coherence, then responded. Her voice was calm, unraised, yet it carried across the room with quiet authority. She stated that silence had never protected her, that compliance had cost her identity, and that she would no longer accept decisions made in her absence. The simplicity of the declaration left no room for argument. For a moment, no one interrupted. The power in the room shifted palpably, not through force, but through certainty. When the Duke stepped forward, he did so not to speak over her, but to stand beside her. The gesture alone carried meaning. He did not present demands or ultimatums. He affirmed that any future arrangement would be contingent upon Maribel's consent, that legitimacy could no longer be buried for convenience. His support was unmistakable, yet restrained, allowing her voice to remain central. It was the first time she had not been spoken for or spoken over. The family's authority fractured completely then, their influence exposed as dependent on secrecy rather than right. Concessions followed, measured and reluctant, but inevitable. Witnesses observed not a rescue, but a reckoning. Maribel felt the weight of the moment settle fully. This was not triumph, it was transition. She had crossed a threshold from endurance into agency, and there would be no return to what had been. Later, alone for the first time that day, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The fear had not vanished, nor had uncertainty, but something more durable had taken root. She had spoken, she had been heard. Her worth had not been negotiated away. The Duke, observing her from a respectful distance, understood that whatever lay ahead would require partnership rather than protection. The woman who had been hidden by design had revealed herself not through defiance alone, but through dignity maintained under pressure. As the house settled uneasily into its altered order, both recognized that the future would not be free of challenge. Yet the foundation had shifted irrevocably. Maribel was no longer a secret to be managed. She was a presence to be reckoned with, and the cost of ignoring her had finally become too great to bear. The days that followed unfolded with a strange duality, part reckoning and part waiting, as though Blackthorn Hall itself were unsure which version of the future it had agreed to inhabit. Word of the confrontation spread quietly but efficiently, carried not by scandal but by observation, by servants who had witnessed authority falter and would not forget it. Maribel felt the change in small, unmistakable ways. Doors were no longer closed in her path. Instructions were phrased as requests rather than commands. Politeness replaced vigilance, though it carried an unease that betrayed how unfamiliar her visibility had become. Attention, once withheld entirely, now hovered without knowing where to settle, and she bore it with careful composure, aware that being seen required a different kind of endurance. Emotionally, the transition was disorienting. Relief surfaced in brief, unexpected moments, followed by guilt that arrived just as swiftly, the old instinct to blame herself for disruption asserting itself despite reason. She reminded herself repeatedly that truth had not created the fracture, only revealed it. Yet the habit of self-erasure resisted surrender, whispering that stability could still be restored if she retreated. Each time the thought arose, she countered it deliberately, grounding herself in the memory of her own voice speaking without apology. Courage, she was learning, did not eliminate fear, it simply refused to obey it. The Duke faced his own consequences, subtler but no less real. Invitations cooled. Conversations shifted tone. Allies who once spoke freely now measured their words, cautious of association with a conflict that threatened inherited order. He accepted the distance without protest, understanding that influence often tested loyalty before revealing it. What mattered more was the clarity that had emerged. He no longer questioned whether intervention had been necessary. The cost confirmed it. In quieter moments, he observed Maribel from afar, noting how she navigated her altered position with restraint rather than entitlement, dignity rather than defiance. She did not demand acknowledgement. She simply occupied space that had long been denied her. When they spoke privately, it was without urgency, their exchanges grounded in reflection rather than strategy. Maribel admitted the confusion she felt, the unfamiliarity of choice after years of constraint. The Duke did not attempt to resolve it for her. He listened, offering presence rather than direction, recognizing that autonomy could not flourish under guidance disguised as care. The balance between them held, deliberate and respectful, shaped by what they had already survived. As Blackthorn Hall adjusted uneasily to its new reality, both understood that resolution had not yet arrived. Exposure invited scrutiny. Scrutiny invited challenge. The path ahead would demand patience rather than confrontation, endurance rather than spectacle. Yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the uncertainty. Maribel was no longer bracing herself against erasure. She was learning, step by careful step, how to remain visible without apology. The Duke, watching that transformation take root, understood that the greatest upheaval was not the scandal avoided or the authority challenged, but the quiet permanence of a woman who had stopped asking permission to exist. The separation was framed as necessity, not punishment, yet it arrived with a weight that neither of them could pretend was incidental. A summons reached the Duke before week's end, formal and insistent, calling him away to address matters that could no longer be delayed without consequence. Political obligations, long deferred in favor of discretion, now demanded presence. He informed Maribel himself, choosing honesty over reassurance, explaining that absence did not signal retreat, but strategy. She listened without interruption, absorbing the reality that growth did not exempt her from uncertainty. Choice, she was learning, often arrived accompanied by distance. When he departed, Blackthorn Hall seemed to contract inward again, as though testing whether its old habits might yet reassert themselves. Maribel felt the absence acutely, not as abandonment, but as exposure. Without the Duke's quiet authority nearby, attention sharpened, scrutiny returned, though tempered now by caution rather than command. She remained composed, refusing the instinct to withdraw, yet the effort required was considerable. Each day demanded conscious presence, deliberate assertion through action rather than declaration. She chose where to walk, whom to address, when to speak, small decisions layered into quiet resistance. The distance forced reflection neither had anticipated. Maribel confronted the depth of her reliance, uncomfortable with how easily safety had become associated with proximity to someone else's power. She resolved not to let growth stall in absence. With measured resolve, she sought counsel from the impartial solicitor the Duke had engaged, continuing to educate herself on the records that defined her past. Knowledge became anchor rather than weapon, grounding her identity in fact rather than permission. Fear remained, but it no longer dictated retreat. She was learning to stand without reinforcement. For the Duke, separation sharpened clarity. Removed from the immediate tension of Blackthorn Hall, he recognized how deeply his concern for Maribel had moved beyond obligation into something personal and exacting. The realization unsettled him, not for its intensity but for its restraint. Affection had grown not through indulgence, but through respect, maintained under pressure. He resisted the impulse to write reassurances, choosing instead correspondence marked by restraint and constancy, careful not to impose presence where independence was forming. Their letters, sparse but precise, sustained connection without dependency. They spoke of facts rather than feeling, yet meaning threaded quietly between lines. Each understood the discipline required to let the other grow without interference. The silence between messages became as significant as their content, proof that trust did not require constant affirmation. As days turned into a measured rhythm of waiting and work, both sensed the change taking root. Separation had not weakened resolve, it had refined it. Maribel, moving through the estate with deliberate calm, recognized that endurance did not require isolation. The Duke, navigating political resistance with steady resolve, understood that restraint could coexist with commitment. Whatever awaited them next would do so, after transformation shaped by distance rather than undone by it. In the Duke's absence, Maribel turned inward with deliberate intention, recognizing that waiting passively would only resurrect habits she had worked to unlearn. She spent her mornings with the solicitor, reviewing documents that traced her history, not as rumor but as record. Each page brought a mixture of clarity and grief, names written and altered, dates amended to suit convenience rather than truth. The process was painstaking, yet grounding. Knowledge, she discovered, did not simply expose injustice. It anchored her, giving shape to an identity long denied definition. For the first time, her past belonged to her, not as burden but as fact. Afternoons were quieter, offering space for reflection she had once feared. Maribel walked the outer gardens without escort, aware of the glances that followed yet unwilling to shrink beneath them. Some eyes held curiosity, others discomfort, but few carried the authority they once had. She no longer adjusted her path to avoid attention. Visibility, she learned, required practice. Each step taken openly reinforced the truth that her presence no longer required justification. The habit of self-erasure resisted, whispering caution, but she answered it with resolve rather than retreat. The Duke's efforts unfolded beyond her sight, yet their impact was tangible. Correspondence from the solicitor confirmed progress, forged documents challenged, testimonies secured, silence unraveling under scrutiny. The work was methodical rather than dramatic, and that steadiness reassured her more than spectacle ever could have done. She understood now that lasting change rarely announced itself loudly. It arrived through persistence, through refusal to accept compromise disguised as mercy. When letters arrived from the Duke, they carried restraint rather than sentiment, updates delivered with clarity and respect. He spoke of obstacles encountered and navigated, of resistance met without concession. He did not frame his efforts as sacrifice, nor did he seek gratitude. The absence of expectation allowed Maribel to read his words without obligation, to receive them as partnership rather than rescue. In response, she wrote carefully, sharing progress without apology, describing growth without dependence. Their exchange remained balanced, shaped by mutual respect rather than need. As weeks passed, Maribel felt herself change in ways subtle yet profound. Fear loosened its grip, replaced by a steadier confidence, grounded not in protection but understanding. She began to imagine a future defined not solely by survival, but by choice. The thought was unsettling and exhilarating in equal measure. For years, she had measured life in terms of endurance. Now, endurance was giving way to intention. By the time word reached her that the Duke's return was imminent, Maribel recognized herself as someone altered by the interval. Distance had not diminished connection. It had refined it. She stood more firmly within herself, no longer bracing against erasure, but prepared to meet whatever followed with clarity earned through patience rather than fear. The Duke returned without announcement, his arrival marked not by ceremony, but by a quiet shift in the atmosphere Maribel sensed before she saw him. Blackthorn Hall had grown accustomed to waiting, and the act of his presence felt like the closing of a held breath rather than interruption. They met in the long east corridor where light filtered through tall windows, neither rushing forward, neither retreating. Recognition passed between them with composed restraint, acknowledging absence and endurance without display. He observed the change in her immediately, the steadiness in her posture, the ease with which she occupied space that had once constrained her. Maribel, in turn, saw in him the marks of resistance weathered and measured, authority tempered rather than diminished. Their first conversation unfolded later, in a sitting room chosen for privacy rather than symbolism. There was no recounting of hardship, no dramatic reunion. Instead, they spoke of progress, of obstacles met and managed, of facts secured rather than fears entertained. The tone was deliberate, grounded, shaped by mutual respect. Maribel listened as the Duke outlined what had been achieved, legal footholds established, silence disrupted through lawful means rather than spectacle. He did not frame his work as triumph, only as movement forward. She responded in kind, describing her own efforts, the confidence gained through knowledge, the discipline required to remain visible without defiance. Emotion surfaced quietly between measured sentences, present without dominance. The space between them felt altered, no longer charged by imbalance or urgency, but steadied by trust refined through distance. When Maribel acknowledged the difficulty of standing alone during his absence, she did so without accusation. The Duke did not apologize. He recognized the weight of her endurance and met it with affirmation rather than reassurance. Both understood that resilience, once tested, did not require constant proof. As they walked together through the grounds later that afternoon, servants observed without comment, accustomed now to a reality that could no longer be undone. Maribel noticed how easily she matched his pace, how naturally conversation flowed without caution. The simplicity of it unsettled her more than drama ever had. This was not secrecy or rebellion, it was presence shared without pretense. That evening, alone once more, Maribel reflected on the meeting with unexpected calm. The fear she once associated with visibility had diminished, replaced by a steadier awareness of her own capacity. The Duke, in his own quarters, recognized the significance of the change. What had grown between them had survived distance not by clinging, but by respecting separation. Their connection had matured into something quieter, more resilient, shaped by choice rather than circumstance. Both understood that challenges remained, opposition not yet exhausted, consequence still pending. Yet the reunion had confirmed something essential. Whatever awaited them next would be faced not from unequal ground, but side by side, with clarity earned through patience rather than impulse. The renewed challenge arrived with calculated precision, announced not through confrontation but through legal notice delivered under seal, its language measured and its intent unmistakable. The family had chosen strategy over surrender, filing a formal petition that questioned Maribel's legitimacy and cast doubt upon the integrity of the evidence assembled thus far. It was an attempt to reclaim control through procedure, to bury truth beneath complexity and fatigue. Blackthorn Hall responded with strained composure, the house once again holding its breath, uncertain which version of authority would prevail. Maribel received the news without visible reaction, though the impact settled heavily within her. This was no longer an abstract threat or whispered plan. It was a direct challenge to her existence, framed as legal necessity rather than personal malice. Old fears stirred, the instinct to retreat, to minimize damage by removing herself from the conflict altogether. Yet that instinct did not command her as it once had. She had endured too much silence to surrender now. Instead, she asked for details, for clarity, for the opportunity to understand the mechanisms being used against her. Knowledge, she had learned, was the only reliable defense against erasure. The Duke approached the matter with deliberate restraint, careful not to eclipse her role in what followed. He explained the implications plainly, the risks involved, the likelihood of public scrutiny intensifying should the challenge proceed. He did not frame himself as solution or shield. He asked how she wished to respond. The question, simple in form, carried profound weight. It acknowledged her authority over her own narrative, something she had never been granted before. Maribel considered carefully, then stated with calm resolve that she would meet the challenge openly. Concealment had never protected her. She would not return to it now. Preparation began immediately, methodical rather than frantic. Documents were reviewed again, testimonies confirmed, inconsistencies identified and addressed. Maribel participated fully, not as observer but as principal, her presence steady during meetings that once would have excluded her entirely. When doubt surfaced, she named it without apology. When fear arose, she acknowledged it without allowing it to dictate retreat. The Duke supported her by maintaining space for her voice, intervening only when necessary to counter procedural manipulation. Their partnership functioned without dominance, grounded in respect refined through adversity. As word of the challenge circulated, social response wavered between curiosity and caution. Some allies withdrew, unwilling to engage in controversy. Others watched closely, assessing where legitimacy might finally land. Maribel felt the weight of attention keenly, yet she did not shrink beneath it. She understood now that scrutiny was not synonymous with condemnation. It was merely exposure, and exposure could be endured. By the time preparations were complete, both recognized the significance of the moment. This was not merely a legal dispute. It was a final attempt to reassert silence through intimidation. Maribel stood ready to confront it, not with defiance, but with clarity. Whatever the outcome, she would no longer be buried by convenience or fear. The offer came quietly, without ceremony or expectation, delivered in the measured tone the Duke reserved for matters he refused to romanticize. They were seated in the smaller study, documents set aside for the evening, the fire low enough to soften shadows without drawing attention to itself. Outside, the estate settled into dusk, unaware of the recalibration about to take place within its walls. The Duke spoke plainly, stating that marriage would provide Maribel with immediate legal protection, social legitimacy difficult to challenge, and a shield against further procedural manipulation. He emphasized what it was and what it was not. It was not a demand, it was not a declaration of sentiment, it was an option, offered because the system arrayed against her respected titles more than truth. Maribel listened without interruption, her expression composed, though the proposal struck deeper than she had anticipated. The practicality of it was undeniable. Marriage would end the challenge swiftly, rendering her family's petition toothless. Yet beneath that logic lay an old, familiar fear. She had spent her life being repositioned for convenience, her choices made conditional upon obedience. The thought of accepting protection at the cost of autonomy unsettled her profoundly. She did not doubt the Duke's integrity, but she questioned the shape of the offer and what it might silently require of her. She did not answer immediately. Instead, she asked questions, careful and deliberate. She asked what expectations would follow, what freedoms might be altered, what compromises assumed. The Duke answered each without defensiveness. He told her he expected no gratitude, no compliance, no erasure of self. He acknowledged the imbalance inherent in the offer and stated plainly that if it threatened her autonomy, it should be refused. Protection gained through obligation, he said, would only replicate the injustice she had escaped. The clarity of his response unsettled her more than persuasion ever could have done. Emotions surfaced slowly, restrained but undeniable. Maribel admitted her fear of exchanging one form of containment for another, of becoming legitimate only by surrendering choice. She spoke of her need to know that any future bond would be entered freely, not under pressure or duress. The Duke listened without interruption, then accepted her hesitation without protest. He did not press for decision or reassurance. He allowed silence to settle, understanding that urgency would compromise trust. When the conversation ended, nothing had been resolved, yet everything had shifted. The offer remained, suspended without expectation, its value defined not by outcome, but by the respect with which it had been made. Maribel returned to her room thoughtful rather than conflicted, aware that for the first time in her life, a path had been presented without coercion. The Duke remained in the study, equally aware that whatever future awaited them could not be built on rescue or necessity. Both understood that the question before them was no longer how to survive the challenge, but how to shape a future without repeating the patterns that had once buried her. The answer, whatever it proved to be, would have to be chosen, not accepted. Maribel did not retreat from the question, nor did she rush toward resolution. The days that followed the Duke's offer were marked by deliberate reflection, not avoidance. She continued her involvement in preparations for the legal challenge, refusing to allow the possibility of marriage to eclipse the work still required. This alone clarified something essential for her. Whatever decision she reached, it would not replace her agency. It would either honor it or be refused. The knowledge steadied her in ways she had not expected. When she sought the Duke again, it was not to accept or decline, but to redefine the terms under which such a future could even be considered. They met in the morning room, light filtering softly through tall windows, the openness of the space mirroring the conversation she intended to have. Maribel spoke first, her voice calm but precise. She told him that protection offered without equality, however well-intentioned, would always carry the shadow of control. She said she would not enter any bond that required gratitude, silence, or submission in exchange for safety. Marriage, if it were ever to exist between them, would have to be chosen freely, without urgency, and without expectation of obedience. The Duke listened without interruption, his expression composed, though the weight of her words was evident. When she finished, he responded with equal clarity. He acknowledged that his position carried inherent power and that offering marriage as solution risked reinforcing the very imbalance they had worked to dismantle. He admitted that part of him had believed practicality sufficient, that legality could substitute for patience. He yielded that belief openly, without defensiveness, stating that any future he shared with her must be built on consent that was complete and unpressured. Protection, he agreed, meant nothing if it cost her autonomy. The exchange altered the ground between them. For the first time, the dynamic shifted fully into equality, not symbolically but functionally. Maribel was no longer responding to circumstances shaped by others. she was shaping them herself. The Duke, in relinquishing control over outcome, demonstrated trust more profound than assurance. The silence that followed was not tense but settled, carrying mutual recognition rather than uncertainty. Maribel did not offer an answer that day. She did not need to. The act of articulating her terms had already transformed the question itself. Marriage was no longer an escape route from danger, nor a shield imposed by necessity. It had become a possibility contingent on mutual respect rather than urgency. That distinction mattered more than decision. As they parted, both understood that something irrevocable had occurred. The future, once shaped by secrecy and fear, was now being negotiated openly. Whatever came next would not replicate the past in subtler form. It would be chosen deliberately, or not at all. In that understanding, trust deepened, quiet and resilient, laying the foundation for whatever path they might eventually walk together. The public appearance was arranged with care, not for spectacle but for precision, every detail chosen to limit distortion rather than invite it. The venue was modest by design, a neutral setting where formality restrained excess and truth could be presented without theatrical interference. Maribel entered the room without escort, her posture composed, her expression steady, aware of the attention gathering in cautious increments. This was not the curiosity that had once frightened her, sharp and speculative. It was measured now, tempered by the knowledge that what followed would be deliberate. The Duke arrived separately, positioning himself not beside her but within view, present, without prominence, signaling support without assumption. When proceedings began, Maribel spoke for herself. She did not recite grievance or appeal to sympathy. She stated facts, clearly and calmly, allowing documentation to support what her voice did not need to dramatize. The records were introduced methodically, discrepancies outlined with precision rather than accusation. Testimonies followed, measured and restrained, confirming what had long been obscured. The effect was cumulative rather than explosive. Murmurs rippled, not with scandal, but with recognition. The truth, when delivered without embellishment, required no defense. Throughout it all, Maribel remained composed, her presence unyielding yet unprovocative. She answered questions directly, refusing speculation, declining to be drawn into emotional interpretation. This restraint altered the room's response more effectively than defiance ever could have done. Observers adjusted their posture, their tone, their assumptions. She was no longer a figure to be managed or pitied. She was a participant asserting clarity. The Duke watched closely, resisting the impulse to intervene, recognizing that her authority in the moment depended on being unshared. His role was not to guide, but to witness. As the presentation concluded, the narrative shifted perceptibly. What had once been whispered as inconvenience was now acknowledged as fact. Doubt lingered in some corners, but it lacked traction. The absence of drama left little room for dismissal. Legitimacy, when claimed with dignity rather than demand, altered the terms of engagement. The family's influence, once exerted through implication and silence, weakened under exposure that refused to inflame. When the gathering dispersed, Maribel felt the weight of what she had done settle fully. Relief came slowly, followed by a steadier sense of ownership over her own narrative. She had not been defended. She had been heard. That distinction mattered profoundly. The Duke approached her only after the room had cleared, acknowledging the moment without praise, stating simply that she had altered the course of what followed. His words carried no claim, no expectation. They recognized effort, not outcome. As they departed separately, both understood the significance of what had occurred. This was not resolution, but recalibration. The balance had shifted not because power intervened, but because clarity endured scrutiny. Maribel walked away knowing she had reframed her story without surrendering herself to it, and the Duke, observing her from a respectful distance, recognized that the future they were approaching would be shaped not by protection, but by partnership earned through restraint and trust. The collapse of the family's authority did not arrive with confrontation or apology, but with exposure sustained long enough to render denial impossible. In the days following the public presentation, inquiries multiplied, no longer whispered but requested formally, their tone measured yet insistent. Records once guarded were produced under obligation, inconsistencies examined with impartial scrutiny. The family responded with controlled courtesy, offering explanations shaped by habit rather than truth. But the veneer no longer held. Silence, once their most effective instrument, had lost its power to intimidate. Maribel faced them not in private, but in a setting chosen deliberately for neutrality, where witnesses observed without allegiance. She entered with composed restraint, aware that this meeting would determine not victory, but closure. The matriarch spoke first, framing decisions as protective measures taken in difficult circumstances, invoking reputation, stability, and sacrifice as justification. The words were familiar, polished by years of repetition, yet they no longer landed with authority. Maribel listened until the cadence of rationalization revealed itself fully, then responded with calm precision. She stated what had been done, how it had shaped her life, and what it had cost, not in sentiment but in fact. She did not seek remorse. She sought acknowledgement. The effect was immediate and irrevocable. Arguments faltered when confronted with clarity that refused embellishment. The family's influence, once exerted through implication, diminished under the weight of documented truth. Concessions followed, reluctant yet unavoidable, not because compassion had awakened, but because power had shifted. Maribel accepted them without triumph, understanding that justice rarely resembled satisfaction. What mattered was not vindication, but the dismantling of a structure that had relied on her silence. Throughout the exchange, the Duke remained present without intervention. His restraint was deliberate, a recognition that this reckoning belonged to her alone. When the discussion concluded, it was Maribel who stood, signaling finality without ceremony. She did not look back. The past, once weaponized against her, no longer required engagement to be overcome. Later, in the quiet that followed, she felt the weight of release settle slowly. Anger had not consumed her, nor had bitterness taken root. What remained was a steadier sense of self, unburdened by the need to prove legitimacy through confrontation. She had spoken, been heard, and chosen to disengage from those who could no longer define her. The Duke joined her afterward, not to congratulate or console, but to acknowledge what had been accomplished through restraint rather than force. He remarked only that the power she had faced no longer belonged to those who had misused it. The observation resonated because it named truth without ownership. As they parted, both understood that something essential had ended. The family's shadow had receded, not because it was defeated, but because it had been rendered irrelevant. Maribel moved forward with a clarity she had never known, aware that the past no longer dictated her position. What lay ahead would be shaped, not by reaction, but by intention freely chosen. What followed the reckoning was not relief, but stillness, the kind that arrived only after prolonged vigilance had finally been released. Maribel found herself unsettled by the quiet, uncertain how to inhabit a world no longer structured around concealment and resistance. The urgency that had sustained her for so long receded, leaving space that felt both liberating and exposed. She moved through her days with measured calm, aware that resolution did not erase habit overnight. Yet beneath the adjustment was a steadier rhythm, one shaped by the knowledge that her life was no longer defined by reaction alone. It was in this interval, absent of crisis, that the Duke and Maribel finally addressed what had grown between them without the pressure of necessity. They met without agenda, neither leading nor avoiding, and for the first time spoke of feeling rather than circumstance. The Duke acknowledged his regard plainly, without embellishment or claim, naming affection that had developed through respect rather than rescue. He spoke of admiration formed not in secrecy, but through witnessing her endurance and restraint. There was no urgency in his tone, no expectation attached to the admission. It existed simply as truth offered without demand. Maribel listened carefully, her response shaped by introspection rather than fear. She recognized the affection within herself as well, quieter than passion, steadier than infatuation, rooted in trust built over time rather than intensity born of crisis. She admitted her feelings without surrendering clarity, aware that naming them did not require immediate decision. What mattered was that they were acknowledged honestly, without obligation or imbalance. The conversation unfolded without haste, allowing vulnerability to surface without overtaking reason. This mutual recognition altered the space between them. The connection no longer relied on shared adversity to justify its existence. It stood on its own, untested by urgency but strengthened by patience. The Duke did not frame the moment as turning point or promise. Maribel did not treat it as resolution. Instead, they allowed it to exist as foundation, something upon which a future could be built deliberately rather than assumed. As days passed, their interactions reflected this shift. They spent time together without necessity, shared conversation without restraint, and navigated proximity without tension. The absence of pressure allowed affection to deepen naturally, unforced and resilient. For Maribel, this was unfamiliar terrain. She had learned to survive attachment through caution. Now, she was learning to choose it through confidence. One evening, as they parted after a quiet walk through the grounds, Maribel realized that fear no longer governed her closeness to him. She did not feel diminished by affection, nor defined by it. The Duke, observing her ease, understood that love offered without demand had found its proper ground. What lay ahead remained unwritten, but it would not be shaped by necessity or rescue. It would be chosen, slowly and with intention, by two people no longer constrained by the past that had once sought to bury her. With the immediate threats resolved, a different unease surfaced, quieter yet persistent, settling into the spaces where urgency had once lived. Maribel recognized it as the after-effect of survival, the disorientation that followed long vigilance. Without crisis to answer, her thoughts turned inward, questioning what remained when struggle no longer defined her days. She moved through the estate with increasing confidence, yet uncertainty lingered at the edges, whispering that stability was temporary, that visibility might still demand a price. The habit of anticipating loss resisted surrender, even as evidence of safety accumulated around her. The Duke sensed the shift without naming it. Their conversations had grown easier, their proximity unstrained, yet he noticed the moments when her gaze withdrew, when reflection replaced presence. Rather than addressing it directly, he chose patience, understanding that reassurance too quickly offered could feel like correction rather than care. He allowed space without distance, remaining available without pressing for intimacy. The balance they had established required attentiveness rather than assumption, a discipline he accepted willingly. Maribel confronted the unease deliberately, refusing to let it shape her future through avoidance. She acknowledged the fear privately, recognizing it not as warning but residue, an echo of years spent preparing for erasure. Stability, she realized, felt unfamiliar because it had never been promised before. The challenge now was not endurance, but acceptance. She practiced remaining present without bracing for withdrawal, a subtle but demanding act of courage. Each day offered small opportunities to trust continuity, to believe that what had been gained did not require constant defense. Their bond deepened through this quiet navigation. Evenings spent in conversation revealed layers previously held in reserve, histories shared not as explanation but as context. The Duke spoke of expectations shaped by duty, of restraint learned early and seldom questioned. Maribel listened with empathy grounded in her own experience of imposed limitation. Recognition flowed both ways, not dramatic but sustaining. What they shared now was not forged by adversity alone, but by mutual willingness to remain present through uncertainty without retreat. One afternoon, walking the outer grounds where hedges softened into open field, Maribel voiced her fear plainly, admitting that peace felt provisional. That part of her still expected the ground to shift beneath her feet. The Duke did not dismiss the concern. He acknowledged it as reasonable, the natural consequence of what she had endured. He offered no promise of permanence, only the assurance that whatever changed would be faced openly, not concealed behind silence. The honesty steadied her more than certainty ever could have done. As the season edged toward renewal, Maribel sensed a quiet transformation taking hold. Fear had not vanished, but it no longer dictated direction. She was learning to inhabit calm without suspicion, to trust presence without needing proof. The Duke, observing this growth, understood that the most difficult passage was not the confrontation of injustice, but the acceptance of peace afterward. What they were building now required patience rather than vigilance, intention rather than resistance. In that understanding, their connection deepened, shaped not by urgency, but by the courage to remain when departure was no longer necessary. Maribel's re-entry into society unfolded without announcement, shaped by intention rather than defiance. She accepted invitations selectively, not to prove belonging but to claim it on her own terms. The gatherings were modest, carefully chosen, spaces where observation outweighed spectacle and curiosity was tempered by formality. She arrived unescorted, her presence unassuming yet assured, aware of the subtle recalibration taking place around her. People adjusted their expectations as they adjusted their posture, responding not to title alone but to the composure she carried with practiced ease. Visibility, she learned, did not require assertion when it was worn naturally. Each encounter demanded restraint of a different kind. Questions arrived indirectly, curiosity masked as courtesy, assumptions embedded in polite phrasing. Maribel answered with precision rather than explanation, refusing to be drawn into narratives that reduced her experience to novelty. The discipline required was considerable, yet she felt no resentment in it. This was not concealment, it was choice. She was defining herself not through reaction but through presence, and the distinction mattered deeply. The Duke observed this transition from deliberate distance, careful not to stand as symbol or shield. He understood that her autonomy depended upon being unclaimed in public, free to move without attribution. Their interactions remained measured, respectful of the space she was establishing. When they spoke privately, it was with quiet pride rather than direction. He recognized the significance of what she was doing. She was not stepping into a role prepared for her. She was shaping one entirely her own. Maribel discovered unexpected confidence in these moments, grounded not in approval, but in alignment. The world did not feel smaller when she entered it openly. It expanded, offering possibilities she had never been permitted to imagine. She found herself speaking more freely, listening with discernment rather than fear, engaging without apology. Each step forward reinforced the truth that her presence was not conditional upon tolerance. It was earned through clarity and restraint. There were moments of doubt, when old habits resurfaced and she questioned whether this visibility was sustainable. In those moments, she grounded herself in what had changed fundamentally. She was no longer reacting to threat. She was acting from choice. The realization steadied her more effectively than reassurance ever could have done. One evening, as she returned from a gathering marked by quiet success rather than attention, Maribel reflected on how far she had come. She no longer measured herself against the expectations of those who once defined her worth. She measured herself against her own values, finding satisfaction in integrity rather than acceptance. The Duke, meeting her later, acknowledged the shift without comment, recognizing that what she was building required observation rather than intervention. As the rhythm of this new life settled into place, both understood the significance of the moment. Maribel was no longer emerging from shadow into borrowed light. She was standing fully in her own, unguarded and unclaimed, shaping a future that did not require justification. Whatever came next would meet her as an equal participant, not a figure defined by secrecy, but a woman who had learned to occupy space with quiet authority and deliberate grace. The consequence arrived with less ceremony than expected, announced through correspondence bearing seals familiar to the Duke and caution to everyone else. A political alliance long maintained through mutual convenience withdrew its support, citing concerns framed as prudence rather than reprisal. The language was careful, the intent unmistakable. His refusal to disengage from Maribel's situation had unsettled balances others preferred undisturbed. Influence, once assumed permanent, revealed its conditions. The Duke accepted the news without visible reaction, yet its implications were considerable. Positions that had opened easily now required negotiation. Favors once extended without question were quietly reconsidered. Power did not vanish, but it narrowed, demanding choice where complacency had once sufficed. Maribel learned of it the same day, not through rumor but directly from him. He did not soften the truth or disguise its impact. He explained what would be lost, what might yet be recovered, and what would remain uncertain regardless of outcome. He did not frame the consequence as sacrifice on her behalf, nor did he suggest that her presence necessitated it. He presented it as fact, allowing her the dignity of understanding rather than protection through omission. The honesty carried weight. It asked something of her without demanding it. She spent the afternoon alone, walking the outer path where hedges gave way to open land, considering what his altered standing would mean if she chose to remain beside him publicly. Association would invite renewed scrutiny, perhaps even revive the narratives she had only just dismantled. The instinct to withdraw surfaced briefly, the old reflex to minimize impact by removing herself from the equation. Yet it did not hold. She recognized it now for what it was, a habit shaped by fear rather than foresight. Choosing absence would preserve comfort, but at the cost of self-betrayal. When she returned, her resolve was quiet and precise. She sought the Duke not to reassure, but to state her decision plainly. She told him she would stand with him openly, not as gratitude or obligation, but as choice. The decision did not come with bravado. It came with clarity. She acknowledged the risk, the potential discomfort, the likelihood of renewed attention. She accepted it nonetheless. What she refused was the implication that safety required retreat. The Duke listened without interruption, receiving her choice without claim. The moment was defined not by declaration, but by mutual recognition. Their first public appearance together after that decision was understated, deliberate in its restraint. Maribel did not seek proximity as symbol, nor did the Duke present her as shield. They moved independently within shared space, their alignment evident without emphasis. Observers noted the shift, registering partnership rather than protection. The balance had reversed. Where once his position might have secured her, now her presence affirmed him. That evening, reflecting on the day's events, Maribel understood the significance of what she had done. She had chosen visibility not because it was safe, but because it was honest. The Duke, recognizing the depth of her resolve, understood that whatever power he had lost had been replaced by something more enduring. What they faced now would be met together, not through necessity, but through deliberate, unwavering choice. Standing beside him altered nothing and everything at once. The world did not erupt into scandal, nor did it retreat into indifference. Instead, it adjusted, testing the new alignment with cautious observation. Maribel felt the attention keenly, yet it no longer unsettled her. She had anticipated scrutiny and found it survivable. The murmurs that followed carried less power than they once might have, softened by the certainty with which she occupied her place. What mattered most was not how others interpreted the choice, but how fully it belonged to her. The Duke, accustomed to command, discovered a different steadiness in accepting support without dominance. Maribel did not defer to his authority, nor did she require it. She offered presence, not protection, and the distinction reshaped their partnership in ways neither had fully anticipated. He recognized that the strength she brought was not symbolic. It was practical, grounding him amid recalibrated influence and narrowed alliances. Her willingness to stand openly altered how others addressed him, less as a solitary figure of power and more as one half of a deliberate union. There were moments of discomfort, inevitable and instructive. An acquaintance who once spoke freely now hesitated, recalculating approach. A gathering that would have welcomed him without question extended invitation with measured formality. Through it all, Maribel remained composed, neither asserting claim nor retreating from association. She allowed the reality of their alignment to speak for itself, understanding that consistency carried more weight than explanation. Each shared appearance reinforced the truth that partnership did not require display to be recognized. Privately, they spoke of the adjustment without tension. The Duke acknowledged the uncertainty, the recalibrations yet to come. Maribel acknowledged her own moments of doubt, the echoes of old fear that surfaced when attention sharpened unexpectedly. Neither treated these admissions as weakness. They recognized them as residue, the natural consequence of stepping beyond roles long enforced. What sustained them was the absence of pretense. They did not promise ease. They committed to clarity. One evening, as they returned from a gathering marked by polite reserve rather than warmth, Maribel reflected on the reversal taking place. Once, she had been hidden to preserve others' comfort. Now, her presence challenged complacency without apology. She realized with quiet satisfaction that she no longer measured success by acceptance. She measured it by integrity maintained under pressure. The Duke, observing her ease, understood that whatever influence he had lost had been exchanged for a partnership that demanded less performance and offered more truth. As the week settled into a new rhythm, the decision proved its resilience. Opposition did not vanish, but it weakened, deprived of the narrative that framed her as liability. Maribel was no longer the risk. Retreat would have been. Standing openly had clarified, rather than complicated what followed. Together, they moved forward not in defiance, but in alignment, aware that unity chosen freely carried a permanence fear could never impose. The doubt arrived quietly, without trigger or provocation, settling into the spaces left by momentum now spent. It emerged not from opposition or scrutiny, but from stillness, from the absence of immediate challenge that had once demanded constant response. Maribel recognized it for what it was, the echo of a life shaped by contingency, where security had always been provisional and permanence an illusion. Now that the external struggle had eased, the question turned inward, unsettling in its simplicity. What remained when vigilance was no longer required? She felt it most acutely in moments of calm, when days passed without incident and evenings unfolded without agenda. The steadiness should have comforted her, yet instead it stirred unease, as though she were waiting for a correction that never came. Old instincts whispered that safety was temporary, that ease preceded loss. She did not voice the fear immediately, wary of granting it authority through speech, but its persistence demanded acknowledgement. Silence, she had learned, did not dissolve uncertainty, it only sharpened it. When she finally spoke, it was without drama, offered during a quiet walk rather than a deliberate conversation. She told the Duke that part of her still expected change to arrive unannounced, that she feared becoming unprepared once vigilance faded. The admission did not weaken her, it clarified her. The Duke listened without interruption, his response measured not to reassure reflexively, but to engage honestly. He acknowledged the reasonableness of her fear, naming it not as doubt in him or in their future, but as residue left by long endurance. Healing, he said, did not erase memory. It learned to coexist with it. They spoke then of uncertainty without urgency, of the reality that no future came with guarantees, only intention. The Duke did not promise constancy as shield against loss. He offered presence as commitment to truth rather than control. Whatever shifted, he said, would be faced openly, without retreat into silence or assumption. The words mattered not because they resolved fear, but because they refused to diminish it. For Maribel, the exchange altered something fundamental. She realized that doubt did not signal failure, it signaled transition. The need to remain guarded was loosening, replaced not by blind trust, but by discernment. She was learning to live without bracing, to allow calm to exist without anticipating its end. The courage required now was different from what she had known before. It was the courage to remain when departure no longer felt necessary. As night settled, the unease eased into something more manageable, no longer dominant, no longer denied. The Duke, observing the shift, understood that this was not a setback, but a deepening. Trust did not eliminate uncertainty. It made space for it, without surrendering direction. What they were building would not be immune to change, but it would not be undone by it either. By the time they parted that evening, the doubt had lost its urgency. It remained, acknowledged but contained, no longer steering their course. What endured was clarity, earned through honesty, rather than reassurance. The future ahead would not be free of questions, but it would be faced without fear dictating retreat, and that understanding marked a turning point more enduring than certainty ever could. The acknowledgement came without fanfare, shaped deliberately to avoid spectacle. The Duke chose a setting that reflected intention rather than display, a modest gathering where formality restrained excess and recognition carried weight without performance. Maribel entered the room beside him, not announced, not presented, but included with quiet certainty. The distinction mattered. She was not being revealed, she was being recognized. The shift altered the air immediately, subtle yet unmistakable, as observers adjusted not to novelty but to permanence. When the Duke spoke, his words were measured and precise. He did not recount history or justify alignment. He stated plainly that Maribel stood with him by choice, that her judgment, intellect, and composure were not extensions of his position but qualities independent of it. He named her as partner in counsel and presence, not as protection afforded or favor granted. The restraint of his declaration carried more authority than proclamation ever could have done. It left no space for reinterpretation. Recognition, once stated without apology, required no defense. Maribel felt the weight of the moment settle fully. This was not rescue or elevation. It was placement, deliberate and earned. She did not respond with gratitude or performance. She met the acknowledgement with composure, offering a brief affirmation that reflected equality rather than deference. Her voice carried steadily, unshaken by attention, shaped by the confidence built through endurance rather than entitlement. The exchange completed something long unfinished. What had once been buried was now named openly, without demand for explanation. The response was measured, not unanimously warm, but respectful. Some faces revealed discomfort, others recalculation, but none carried dismissal. The room adjusted around the truth presented, recognizing that legitimacy asserted calmly left little room for challenge. Maribel understood then that visibility no longer felt precarious, it felt settled. The fear that once accompanied acknowledgement had loosened its grip, replaced by a steadier awareness of belonging chosen rather than negotiated. Later, in private, neither spoke immediately of what had occurred. The significance lay not in reaction, but in the ease that followed. The Duke did not seek reassurance. Maribel did not question outcome. The recognition had not altered who they were to one another. It had aligned the external with the internal, closing the gap between truth lived and truth acknowledged. That harmony carried its own quiet relief. As evening gave way to reflection, Maribel considered the distance she had traveled from secrecy to certainty. She had not been claimed to secure position. She had secured position by refusing erasure. The Duke, observing her calm, understood that what he had affirmed publicly was long established privately. Partnership did not diminish authority. It refined it. The future ahead would still demand navigation, still require patience and restraint. But the foundation beneath it no longer shifted. Maribel stood where she belonged, not because permission had been granted, but because presence had been sustained. What had begun in silence now endured in recognition, steady and irrevocable. What followed recognition was not celebration, but negotiation, the quiet and necessary work of shaping a future that would not default to old patterns simply because they were familiar. Maribel understood this instinctively. Visibility had been earned, not inherited, and maintaining it required intention rather than assumption. She did not wish to be absorbed into a life already defined. She wished to participate in defining what came next. The Duke welcomed this without hesitation, recognizing that partnership required more than alignment of feeling. It demanded clarity of expectation. They spoke at length over several evenings, not in moments stolen between obligations, but in time deliberately set aside. Practical matters surfaced first: residence, travel, correspondence, the balance between privacy and presence. Maribel stated plainly that she would not retreat into ornamental distance, nor surrender independence under the guise of discretion. The Duke listened, acknowledging that tradition often disguised control as courtesy. He responded with equal transparency, outlining responsibilities that came with his position and the constraints he could not simply discard. What mattered was not elimination of structure, but consent to it. Emotion threaded through these discussions, present but unexaggerated. Maribel admitted her need for space to continue shaping her identity beyond reaction to past injustice. The Duke admitted his instinct toward control, honed by years of managing consequence, and his deliberate effort to unlearn it. Neither framed these admissions as flaw or failure. They named them as realities to be navigated rather than ignored. The honesty deepened trust more effectively than reassurance ever could have done. As terms took shape, something steadier emerged between them. They were not negotiating safety, they were negotiating respect. Maribel felt the unfamiliar relief of being consulted rather than accommodated. The Duke experienced the unexpected steadiness of yielding without loss of authority. Power shared, he discovered, did not diminish. It clarified. Outside, observation continued, measured and cautious. Those who watched sensed change, not through announcement, but through consistency. Maribel's presence remained assured, neither withdrawn nor performative. The Duke's manner adjusted subtly, his authority less solitary, his decisions informed by counsel he did not dominate. The partnership began to register not as disruption, but as evolution. One evening, as conversation slowed into reflection, Maribel recognized the quiet certainty settling within her. She was no longer bracing against erasure or guarding against obligation. She was choosing, deliberately and without haste. The future no longer felt like territory to be defended. It felt like ground to be shaped. The Duke, observing her ease, understood that what they were building could not be rushed without fracture. Patience was not delay, it was structure. Together they accepted that stability would not come from certainty of outcome, but from commitment to process. Whatever challenges remained would be met within boundaries chosen rather than imposed. As the discussions concluded, nothing felt resolved in the sense of finality, yet everything essential had been established. Equality was no longer aspirational, it was practiced. The life ahead would not erase the past, but it would not be governed by it either. Maribel stepped forward not into shelter, but into shared ground, confident that what followed would be shaped with intention rather than fear. The crisis that followed was so quiet it nearly went unnoticed, lacking the drama that once would have commanded immediate response. It arrived in the form of a letter forwarded without comment, its contents unremarkable to any casual reader, yet charged with implication for Maribel alone. A distant relation, long silent, had resurfaced with a request framed as reconciliation, hinting delicately at past grievances misunderstood and wounds perhaps exaggerated. The language was careful, almost kind, yet beneath it lay the familiar attempt to reshape memory, to soften responsibility through appeal rather than acknowledgement. Maribel felt the old tension stir, not fear exactly, but the instinct to question herself, to wonder whether clarity had been too severe, whether distance had been unnecessarily final. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she allowed the discomfort to surface fully, examining it with the patience she had learned to cultivate. The pull was not toward reconciliation itself, but toward the relief of closing a chapter neatly, without edges left unresolved. That desire unsettled her. She recognized it now as a vestige of training, the impulse to smooth conflict for the comfort of others. The letter did not ask for understanding. It asked for erasure, subtle and polite. Seeing it clearly diminished its power. When she shared the letter with the Duke, she did so without asking for direction. She spoke of the unease it stirred, the temptation to resolve rather than resist. He listened without interrupting, careful not to frame the moment as test or threat. When he responded, it was not with advice, but with reflection. He observed that peace offered without accountability often demanded silence in return. The insight did not instruct her. It mirrored what she already knew. They discussed the matter briefly, then let it rest. The decision belonged to her alone. That night, Maribel wrote a response measured and restrained, neither conciliatory nor confrontational. She acknowledged receipt, stated her position clearly, and declined engagement without accountability. The letter contained no accusation, no justification. It simply marked a boundary. When she sealed it, she felt neither triumph nor regret, only a steadier sense of alignment. The quiet resolution revealed something essential about what they were building together. Strength no longer depended on dramatic opposition. It existed in discernment exercised without validation. The Duke, observing her ease afterward, understood that the most significant trials were no longer external. They were internal negotiations, moments where old patterns resurfaced, seeking familiar authority. Maribel was meeting them with clarity rather than reaction. As days passed without consequence, the significance of the moment settled fully. No retaliation followed. No pressure returned. The silence that remained was different from the silence of erasure. It was chosen. Maribel recognized the distinction with quiet satisfaction. She was no longer compelled to resolve every discomfort to justify her place. Stability did not require constant proof. The Duke noted the change as well, the way she moved through the days unburdened by the need to anticipate challenge. What had once required vigilance now required presence. Their bond deepened not through shared crisis, but through mutual respect for boundaries maintained without explanation. The quiet test had passed without spectacle, confirming that maturity, once earned, did not need to announce itself to endure. Reflection arrived gradually, settling into Maribel's thoughts not as nostalgia but as recognition. With the immediate challenges resolved and the quieter tests met, she found herself looking back, not with longing or bitterness, but with clarity earned through distance. The past no longer rose to confront her. It presented itself as something already examined, its shape understood, its influence acknowledged without authority. She walked the grounds one morning alone, noticing how familiar paths felt different now, less constraining, more expansive. The estate had not changed. She had. She considered the years spent navigating silence, the discipline of restraint mistaken for virtue, the careful shrinking that had once felt necessary for survival. Those instincts had not vanished entirely. They surfaced at times, subtle and insistent, but she recognized them now as echoes rather than guides. Courage, she realized, had not appeared in a single decisive moment. It had accumulated slowly, through repeated choice, through refusal to retreat when retreat was no longer required. The realization did not inspire pride so much as steadiness. She had become someone she could inhabit without apology. When she spoke of these reflections to the Duke, it was without drama, offered as observation rather than confession. He listened with the attentiveness that had long since ceased to surprise her, allowing her words to stand without interpretation. He did not frame her growth as transformation bestowed through circumstance. He recognized it as evolution shaped by endurance and intention. The distinction mattered. It honored her agency without diminishing the cost of what she had survived. Their conversation turned, briefly, to the future, not in terms of ambition or expectation, but of alignment. Maribel acknowledged that she no longer feared becoming defined by partnership, nor did she fear solitude. Both felt possible now, choices rather than threats. The Duke admitted that witnessing her clarity had altered his own understanding of permanence. Stability, he said, did not come from control or prediction, but from the willingness to remain responsive rather than rigid. They shared the thought without pressing it further, content to let meaning settle naturally. Later, alone again, Maribel wrote briefly in a journal she had kept since reclaiming her history, not to record events, but to mark understanding. She noted that resolution did not feel like triumph. It felt like quiet competence, the ability to move forward without bracing for loss. The past remained part of her, but it no longer demanded constant negotiation. She had integrated it, not erased it. As evening approached, the Duke joined her on the terrace, conversation unhurried, presence unforced. They stood side by side without the need to define the moment, both aware that what had once felt precarious now felt grounded. The absence of urgency did not diminish connection, it confirmed it. Maribel understood then that becoming was not an event completed, but a process sustained. She had not been remade. She had been revealed to herself over time, through pressure that refined rather than broke her. Whatever lay ahead would meet her not as someone emerging from shadow, but as a woman fully present, shaped by the past yet no longer governed by it, ready to move forward with dignity intact and choice firmly her own. They chose privacy over declaration, understanding that what mattered most did not require witness. The decision was made quietly, without ceremony or urgency, shaped by intention rather than culmination. One evening, as the estate settled into familiar calm, Maribel and the Duke spoke with a clarity that required no rehearsal. They acknowledged what had been growing steadily between them, not as inevitability, but as choice reaffirmed through time, restraint, and mutual respect. There was no promise offered to silence fear or guarantee ease. What they shared rested instead on trust, proven through patience. Maribel recognized that this commitment felt different from anything she had imagined in earlier years. It did not ask her to surrender herself for belonging. It welcomed her as she was, with history acknowledged rather than erased. The Duke, in turn, accepted the bond without assuming ownership or authority, understanding that partnership endured only where autonomy remained intact. Their agreement was not sealed through words alone, but through understanding that neither would require diminishment for the other to stand. When they parted that night, nothing outward had changed, yet everything essential had settled into place. What bound them now was not necessity or protection, but deliberate alignment. The future remained unwritten, but it would be entered together, quietly and with intention, shaped not by fear of loss, but by the confidence to choose and be chosen without condition. The final reckoning did not arrive as confrontation, nor as triumph, but as release so gradual it almost escaped notice. Blackthorn Hall no longer held the same weight it once had, its corridors stripped of the authority that had relied on silence to endure. The past remained, but it no longer reached for Maribel with grasping insistence. What had been buried was now known, acknowledged, and rendered powerless by the simple fact of truth lived openly. The family's shadow faded not through punishment, but through irrelevance, its influence diminished by the refusal of one woman to remain unseen. Maribel stood one morning at the edge of the grounds, the air cool and steady, aware of how different the stillness felt now. It no longer pressed against her chest, it offered space. She understood then that closure had not come from apology or vindication, but from autonomy fully claimed. Her life was no longer shaped in reaction to what had been taken from her. It was shaped by what she chose to build next. The knowledge settled with calm certainty, neither loud nor fragile. The Duke joined her without announcement, his presence familiar and unintrusive. They spoke of practical matters, of travel and time, of futures that would unfold gradually rather than decisively. There was no need to define what they had chosen together. It existed already in how they moved beside one another, in the absence of fear that once dictated caution. Partnership no longer felt like risk. It felt like alignment maintained through respect, rather than effort. As the day progressed, Maribel moved through the house with ease, no longer conscious of watching eyes or measured steps. Servants greeted her without hesitation, not out of obligation, but recognition. The shift was complete. She had not replaced one role with another. She had stepped beyond roles entirely, into a life where presence did not require justification. The quiet dignity of that freedom surpassed any vindication she might once have imagined. Later, as evening settled, Maribel reflected briefly on the girl she had been, trained into silence, taught to disappear for the comfort of others. She did not mourn that self. She honored her endurance. Without it, this moment would not exist. The past had shaped her, but it no longer confined her. When night fell, she and the Duke stood together beneath a sky unmarked by urgency, aware that what lay ahead would not be free of challenge, nor would it require retreat. They would meet it as they had learned to meet everything else, openly and with intention. What had begun as secrecy ended as chosen belonging, not bestowed, not claimed, but lived. The story did not close with spectacle. It closed with certainty. Maribel was no longer a secret to be buried. She was a woman fully seen, fully present, and finally free to move forward into a future, shaped not by fear, but by love chosen without condition.